You can get this at blender.org. It's a free download. There's a ton of tutorials online or through lynda.com if you want to learn how to use this to its full extent. But today I'm just going to show you, as I said, the basics of how to create game assets in Unity, just a little platform and the level itself. I'm going to take that model, import it into Unity, and then I'm going to show you how to attach different objects like colliders and put in a first-person controller into Unity and walk that around the scene, and you can get the idea of how that works. And we'll do a little bit of scripting today. So let's switch over. Actually, I want to do create a new file. So just hit Command N or Control N, and so you're presented with this default Blender scene, and it starts you out with a cube, a light, and a camera. And so if you were to render this object or the scene right now, you would just get just a cube that's lit from the top right hand corner. And the way that I did that rendering is I just hit F12, and if I hit escape, you get back out of it. So far so good. Now if we zoom in and out, or if we use our it depends on what control you have. Right now I'm on a trackpad because I don't have my mouse with me, but if I scroll around with my two fingers, it's going to kind of roll around the scene like this. I can look under the model. Now, depending upon how you have Blender set up, I went into my preferences and I went into the interface, and I made sure that the input, I should say, select with left is selected. So the default for Blender is to select objects and vertices and things like that with your right mouse button. So that's kind of weird. So not most people, but a lot of people will switch this back over to left select, and that's what I prefer, certainly with a trackpad what I'm using today, which I don't recommend, by the way. But if you hold down the control button and scroll up and down, you'll zoom in and out. And then finally, if you hold down the shift and also scroll, you'll just pan around. So we're going to use those basic controls today. I'm going to select the cube, either right click if you have the default, or I'm going to left click because I've changed mine. Hit the X key to delete this. And what I'm going to do is hit select or Shift A to add. You can also access this in the bottom left hand corner menu. And the menu that pops up is, the first one that I want is Mesh. And what I'm going to do is create a little platform. We're going to create an elevator or kind of like a lift to lift our player up into our game scene. So I'm going to start out with a circle. We can start out with a plane or a cube like you just saw. There's something called a UV sphere. There's an icosphere, a cylinder, a cone, and what's called a torus, which is a donut. So if you want to model a donut, you probably will start with that mesh shape. And just because I create a shape doesn't mean I can't manipulate it into something else later, but you're trying to make it easier on yourself. So what you want to do is, if I'm going to make a chair, for example, maybe I start out with a cube because a chair has more of a cube shape. If I'm going to start out making like a Coke bottle or a beer bottle or something, whatever you want to do, you might start out with something more like a cylinder. So you want to try to start out with your starting mesh, very similar shape with what you're trying to model. If it's a more complex object like a motorcycle, where you can't even think where would you start, maybe you start out with the tire, in which case you might do a circle and then expand that out to round it off and that sort of thing to make a tire. Or maybe you start out with a torus, which kind of more has a tire shape, and then maybe shape that more into a tire for a motorcycle, and then work your way from there. Maybe make for the forks that hold the tire, maybe a cylinder, the two forks that are on either side of the tire for a motorcycle, you do that, you have two cylinders on either side, that sort of thing. And so as you get more familiar with 3D, you'll figure these things out. In worst case, a lot of people, they just start out with planes. They start out with planes and then they manipulate that into something more 3D. So we're going to actually do it that way. We're going to start out with a circle. So I selected circle, and you can see in the center here is where it created our circle. And it's always going to create it where this, it's a red and white circular object with a crosshairs through it. That's called the 3D cursor. It's always going to create the object where that 3D cursor is. And if you can move that, in my case I'm going to right click and you can move it that way. There's other ways to move it, but that's just where it starts out. So if you move that cursor and then you go to add an object to your scene, you might actually wonder where it is. It's not in the center of your scene, it's somewhere off where the 3D cursor is. So when we do that, I'm going to hit the F6 key to bring up this menu so that I can manipulate this circle that I've just added. Because we're not finalized yet, we haven't actually created it, just putting it on our scene. If I was to go and select something else, then it would actually put it there. And so what this is asking me is, how many vertices do you want in this circle? Because it's a game asset, I don't want to overload my meshes. I don't want to put too many vertices in them, because the more vertices we have, the slower that it's going to run on our computer. So for instance, if we have 32 vertices, then it's going to have to calculate in 3D space those 32 vertices plus whatever we have in our scene. But if I can make that 16 vertices, let's click off of that, you can see that it becomes less detailed, less smoothed, but for a game that might actually be okay. Because what you can actually do is do smooth shading on it, which will kind of do the average of those vertices and smooth it out. So even though this looks kind of, hopefully you can see that in the back, it looks kind of like closer to a stop sign than a circle, this should be pretty good for our game asset. So I'm going to do 16 vertices, and what I was going to say before is that's half the vertices that we had with the 32, obviously, but it's going to also run twice as fast, starting with a low vertices count. So if I go over here in the menu that's open, if I hit smooth, well, let me back up. I'll do that in a second. Let's actually add some geometry to this circle. So this is going to be our platform. It's going to lift the player up, and so right now it's just circles, and we have to fill this in. Now, if I make sure the object's selected, hit the Tab key, and that'll actually allow me to edit this object. And you can see, hopefully you can see that in the back, we have little tiny points that we can grab. Hit the G key or use these little arrows just like we do in Unity to grab it up. And in Blender, the vertices are different from what they are in Unity, so just be careful. In Unity, Z is in the up direction, X is toward the camera currently, and Y is off to the right. And so, again, that's flipped on its side in Unity, but I can grab this with the G key and just move it around. If I hit escape, that undoes that. I can grab it with the handle, as I mentioned, so I can manipulate this circle maybe to make it look a little bit less like a circle, if that's what you're going for. So that looks more like a Millennium Falcon than a platform. And what you could do is hit the A key to select all of these objects, and that's going to allow me to then take every one of those points, duplicate them, and bring them straight up. So let me do that. Hit the E key, and then you can see that now I'm moving this in the Z position, but also it's actually relative to the camera, so I can move this left and right. If you want to constrain it to a particular axis as you're moving it around, you can hit the Z key, and that'll move it up and down in the Z axis. And you can kind of see it's getting a little larger as it's raising up, or at least it appears like that. Let me hit the escape key, and then I'm going to hit the 5 key on my keyboard, and it changes the perspective a little bit. So if we roll around here, you can see that this square here is pretty much the same size as the bottom square here. If I hit the 5 key again, this puts it in perspective mode, where now things that are farther away appear smaller. And if you're on a laptop and you want that same functionality, you have to actually change it. So open up the preferences, Command, comma, or you can go in the menu, File and Preferences to get this. And then for, I think, let's see, so we're, yeah, so it should be under input. Sorry, the screen is really small. This checkbox here, emulate numpad, make sure that's checked if you're using a laptop. So I actually do most of my 3D editing on a laptop. I do have an extended keyboard with a number pad on it that I sometimes hook up, but depending upon where I am, I might not have that. I always have an external mouse for sure, because it would drive me insane trying to do this on a trackpad like I'm doing today. But so make sure that checkbox is checked, it's off by default. Hit Save User Settings after you do that, hit the close button, and so now again 5 will put it in perspective mode, or what we call orthographic mode. And so I prefer to do my editing in orthographic mode. So let's get back into editing. I'm actually going to undo all of that just by hitting Command Z, like edit undo style. Going back, and now I'm going to extrude, so using that E key. Extrude it, hitting the E key, so now you can drag this around, but I'm going to hit the Z key to raise that platform up, and it's going to just be kind of like a little saucer, kind of like on an alien ship kind of thing. So I'm not going to make it too tall, so that looks about good. And then what I want to do is, right now it's just a ring, kind of like a wedding ring. I need to actually have a platform for the user to stand on, or the player to stand on. And so I'm also going to use that extrude, so I'm going to hit the E, but instead of moving it around or hitting the Z key, I'm going to hit the S key for scale. And now it gives you this little arrow that's a dotted line pointing to the center. So if I raise that up, you can see that that kind of makes it more like a fan shaped, or a lip to maybe like a swimming pool. But if I drag that in, now you can see that it becomes a platform. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to drag it almost to the center. I'm going to click the mouse button. I'm going to zoom in, holding down Control and scrolling my mouse, holding Shift and panning with my mouse. And what I'm going to do, let's see. Let me try this. I haven't actually tried it. Usually what you do is you'd fill this in. You'd fill in this circle to try to make quadrilaterals, or actually just quads, where, let me show you that process. I don't want to talk too much about this, but by holding down the select key, I can select multiple faces on here. So I select 4, I hit the F key to make a face out of that, and then I can do that all day long. What you can also do is hold down the Alt key and select the ring, and then hit the F key, and that'll just fill it in. But when you import it into Unity, you're not really sure how Unity will break this up, because it always breaks it up into triangles, and that's the key. Is you want to make everything into a quad, because quads break up very, very easily with into triangles. Obviously, there's 4 points. You just take any 2 of those points that are not adjacent to each other, and now you have quads. And so, well, let me just go through this really quickly. So, because I'm just going to do this. So, four faces here, or 4 vertices make a face. Let's see. Oh, I actually created this with 16. Okay, that's fine. Just going to go through this really quickly. F. And the really hard part that I find with 3D editing is, all right, I've tried to stick with making these quads, but you can see that there's some empty space that is a triangle. And that's probably okay if I just fill that in for our game, but I want to try to be consistent. So I'm going to use the knife tool, which is K, and drag across over here. Oops, let me undo that. So the K tool, and I'm going to split this across here, hit the Enter key, and now that's split across. And what that also did is add a vertice here and here. Let me zoom in on that. So now I have 4 points. And so there's these little tricks that you pick up to try to make everything 4 points, which is a little silly that I have to do. I'm going to turn off this little gadget. Feel free to keep it on, but okay. So now I have my platform with everything's a quad that breaks up nicely into triangles. I'm going to do one more thing to add a little bit of detail. I'm going to hit Control R to put in an edge loop, and this edge loop is just going to add more geometry. So I'm going to put one here, and then once I click, it'll allow me to scale it. So I'm going to scale a little bit toward the center, and then I'm going to add another one, Control R. You can see, click, and then I can scale that out. I'm going to put that kind of in the center here, click. And then I'm going to grab these inner loops here by holding down the Option key and the Shift key. Shift adds to the selection. And now I can, what I'm going to do is kind of lower this just a little bit. And the way we do that is extrude it. And I'm going to extrude it down. So I'm going to hit the E key and the Z key and move that up and down. Actually, Z Okay, apparently I didn't hit Z. So make sure Z and you get the axes there. And I'm just going to try to drop that down just slightly there. Okay, and now I'm going to hit the tab key to get out of that. And you can see what that looks like. Just pretty basic platform. You can add details as you want. I'm going to go over here on the left-hand side and hit smooth. And you can see that it just kind of made it look all funny. So I'm going to go tab back into that. And the reason why is because when you do smooth shading, it takes all your vertices and kind of averages them out and kind of rounds them off in places. So it did a pretty good job on the outside here. But what you can do is continue to add those edge loops around the outside and around these edges to kind of tighten those up a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit of extra geometry, and as you can see, that blackness that you see hovering there kind of goes away as I bring this edge closer to the other edge. Another edge loop here, drag that out. And so essentially what you're doing is not only do you have a corner, but you have geometry that tightens up that corner. So that is all I'm doing here. Alright, so this is our platform for our game, and you can see it's a dark shape, and actually that's not correct because what we need to do is there are things called normals, and that's just the direction that your 3D object is facing. So right now it's actually facing down, and if I hit the N key, you can open up this menu, scroll down to where you see normals, and do the one that looks like the face of this cube, and you can see that it added dots, but the dots are facing the wrong direction. If I go under this, you can see all the normals are facing down. And if you've ever been in a video game where there's like a glitch where you can see through a wall, or you're on the outside of a house that you're supposed to be on the inside of, and half the house is gone, it's like somebody just chopped it in half. You can see the back wall, but the front wall or the outside of the house is invisible. And that's because the normals for that 3D object are facing the wrong way. In game development, we only render the meshes for normals that are facing us. And so again, if you've ever seen anything from the backside, that's what happens, is that the game engine never renders that. And so if I exported this into Unity, you would never see it. If you were underneath it, you would see it. So the way that we do that, or fix that, select all the objects by hitting A, and it's Control N, and that'll flip it the other way. If it doesn't do what you expect it to do, then you can hit this little thing shows up, or hit the F6 key and do inside, and it'll flip those to the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Let's see. Let's just put that in floor plan. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to throw that model away because I have one that I prepared earlier on. Oh, wait, is that the right one? Let's see, where did that one go? Let's do live surroundings. Okay, so this is one I prepared before class, and if we scroll or pan down, hold the shift key and scroll, you can see at the bottom here is where our platform is going to start, and then using a cylinder, same tools that I just showed you, I put this lift or this tower in, and so our lift is going to start from the bottom, raise up to the top. We're going to have in Unity, we're going to have a trigger that when that lift gets all the way up to the top so that the user can step off, it's going to trigger that trigger, make the platform stop, and then our player can then walk into this kind of little, I don't know what you call this, little hallway, I guess. And you can see that the normals are facing inward. Okay, so they're all facing toward each other, because if I was on the outside, I wouldn't be able to see on the inside. But I'm in the inside, so I want all the normals facing me so that they render. And I'll show you what this looks like in a second in Unity. And then we get to, let me zoom out so you can actually see the whole thing. This is our level. Very, very simple level. Excuse the middle geometry there. I didn't feel like fixing this. This is extra polygons that we don't need. But here's our door here, and then this is just a big box of is our game level. And so there's many ways to create game levels in Unity. This is just one where you create the asset in a 3D application and bring it in. Normally what you'd want to do is make it modular. So I showed you in the last class our dungeon scene where we had these different wall pieces and bookshelves and candles. You can bring all those in and construct your scene this way. Or you could do it in Blender and do the whole thing like this in Blender. But what you want to do in Blender instead is, again, make those pieces modular. So maybe I make a wall that's only a quarter of this size, and then I construct 4 of those to make this wall, or 5 of them if I choose to expand it. Because if you wanted to expand it in the game, you're playing the game, you're like, yeah, this hallway isn't long enough, or it's too long. I'd have to go back into Blender and shorten that up and then re-import it, which is an easy task. But if it's all modular, then I can just go and I can do all that manipulation in Unity. So you don't want to switch between your tools. Okay, so let's go back into Unity here, and we're going to open up give this a second. It's going to open up I've just called this store. And let me double click on our first person controller. So here is the model that I designed outside of class. Let me move this back to the tab. But it's using pretty much the same. Where are we? Oh, this is game scene. So. Okay, so as I said, it's pretty much the same. I didn't choose smooth shading on this. Actually, I did, but I used a 10-sided circle instead, just to give it kind of a, I don't know, flatter shape. There's a lip on the outside, and basically what I showed you. And then I added some railings and did that sort of thing. But if you notice all these wireframes here, that is our first-person controller. So I showed you the third-person controller last class. This one, because you don't actually see the player, we have this capsule collider, which is going to stop our player from running into things. We have a camera, what's actually going to be shown to the player on his screen. And then we have this little listener or speaker that is going to be our kind of sound effects and our listening for when things happen. So that's just what that is, and you can see where the camera position is initially pointing to. You can see that big square. That's going to define the dimensions of what our player sees. Okay, so we have that, and then as I showed you in the last Blender file, here's our big level. But you notice that I can always look inside of this tube, and again, that has to do with the normals being shown, and as I rotate this around, it's always a half circle, because it doesn't render the backside of those normals. Now in Blender, it'll absolutely render the backside of those normals if you want it to, and that's just a render setting that you can have. But again, in Unity, we want to save CPU power or GPU power. We don't always want to have to render everything, especially if it's on the backside of a wall, for example. Okay, so all I did was drop my blender.blend file into Unity, and I have this geometry here. I selected that after dragging it in my scene and positioning it. I added a mesh collider, and the mesh collider is every time we have a vertice in our level here, it'll add a collider between those points. And so everywhere that there's level to interact with, it'll stop our player from doing that. So our player also has a collider on it, as does our lift. So you can see our lift has a box collider, and this is just going to define that the floor, because I don't really need these railings to be stopping the player, because actually this tube will stop the player. I don't need to worry about the player falling off. And if I did, maybe I put another box collider on this side, another box collider on this side, etc., etc. So you set up the box colliders so that they don't, so that the player can't go beyond them. If you're jumping on boxes, you'd put a box collider on that box so that the player can jump on top of it. What we also have is this object here. It's what we call an empty, or an empty game object, and I couldn't see it in the game scene here, but if you select it from the list here, I just called it elevator stop, and all this is, because it's empty, is an empty object with a box collider on it. But the difference is I've checked this box is trigger, and so instead of stopping my player, because when I initially added this to the scene, I just ran it. I forgot. I just wanted to test it, and I ran it. What I forgot to do was check that box, and so when my player came up, he hit his head on it, and a whole bunch of crazy things happened because now you have these two colliders squishing the player. There's no logic to kill that player, so nothing really happened, just kind of get all jerky and things like that. But by making it a trigger, we're telling Unity we don't want the player to stop, we want it to actually trigger an event. So what is that event? Let's switch over to MonoDevelop, which is our IDE for editing code. So this should look a little familiar with you guys, especially if you've used C# in the past. This is what that is. So we import our package Unity engine using the using. And when you create a new file, by the way, most of this stuff is filled in for you. So I wrote this code to make sure that it actually works before coming to class, because in previous classes I've tried to live code, and the code complete in this is not as good, and the error handling is not as good as like Android Studio or Xcode. So decided to do this before class so I wouldn't make a fool of myself. But starting from the top, this should be pretty obvious to you guys, especially if you're familiar with object-oriented programming. So we have a public float value called lift speed, and we just set that to 0.6. We have another one that's a Boolean called is lift active. So I want to stop that lift eventually. So right now, when the game starts, it's true, and it'll lift our player up. We get a reference to our player, and all objects within Unity are game objects. And then our player has a transform object called player parent, and this is just to make the lift smooth, so don't worry too much about it. When our game object that this script is attached to, namely the elevator, the lift, when it gets instantiated, start gets called. So this method start that we have gets instantiated. So what I want to do is get a reference to the player. So I do that by doing game object, which is a singleton, and there's a class method on that called find game object with tag. I've added the tag to my player, and if you're curious how I do that, I go down to my first person controller, which I just drag in from the standard assets. I showed that last class. I go down to its tag here and select player, and there's other tags that we can do. So that's all I need to do is just pass in the string for that, and I get a reference to our player. So it's kind of like adding an ID for Android. Just give it an ID and then find it. And hopefully you don't give multiple objects the same tag, though you could, and then you could loop through that, but that's a little bit different scenario. The player parent, again, I'm just going to parent our player to the lift, so the lift is a lot smoother. Basically what you're doing is just kind of combining those two objects and lifting them up at the same time, because on update, which gets called every time per frame, like the comment says, we're going to check to see if that Boolean value is true. And if it's true, so is lift active, I am going to then do this transform.translate. And what that's going to do is this refers to the lift, because I'm going to drop this script onto our lift game object, our 3D model there. And so every time the game updates as it goes through its game loop, which we talked about last week, I'm going to take the transform object, which allows me to manipulate this object in space, and do a translation from point A to point B over time. And so the way that we do that is a little convenience method, vector3, that just means it has an x, y, z coordinate. If you're doing a 2D game, it would be vector2. And there's a little convenience constant in here that is, in our case, it's dot up, so that I want to move it in the up position. Now the up position in Unity is the x-axis, not the z-axis like it is in Blender. But if you read the summary, I don't know if you can read that in the back, it says shorthand for vector3 parentheses 0, comma x, I'm sorry, the y position. I said the x position. 0, comma 1, comma 0. So all I'm doing is saying move in the y position one unit multiply that by the lift speed. So if we want to go faster, we multiply it by a higher number. And then also, I mentioned, I don't know if it was last class or the class before, that when you do your game loop and you're tying that to the speed of the CPU, that faster games will have a higher frame rate, and therefore if you're moving from A to B over a couple, let's say 20 frames, it's going to move a lot faster on a newer machine than it is on a slower machine. So the way that we handle that in Unity is time.delta time. And what this object is, or this value is, it's a floating point value that just essentially tells us how much time has passed since the last frame was executed. And so this is just a way to say, okay, well, the last frame happened a long time ago, so multiply this by a bigger number in order to have the same effect that if it happened a short time ago. And so this might get executed 1,000 times on fast machines, but the delta time is going to be a lot smaller per instance than if it gets executed 100 times, and this delta time will be a lot bigger, therefore it will happen a lot faster on slower machines. And then we use the translation for space.world, and that's just saying lift it up relative to the world and not the object itself. Because if the object itself is turned on its side and you're saying go in the Y position, that might actually be to the right or to the left. And so we're just saying move up relative to the world. So if you guys ever took vector geometry or any kind of geometry, this might start slowly coming back to you. I know it did with me when I started getting into this stuff, but pretty interesting stuff. I mean, if they had taught me this stuff in geometry class and vector geometry, I would have paid a lot more attention, but hopefully you guys still remember that. Now, the final method that I've added is on trigger enter. So this is where the magic happens that stops our lift. So because we have this trigger collider that's at the top of our lift, this method will get called when we run into that. And so I could check this object to say, okay, is it this particular object or what object is it? But I only have one in my scene, so I don't even check that. And so I instantly do is lift active, set that to false. I do a little debug statement just to print that out to the console. And then the next time our game loop runs through is active is false, this stop gets getting executed and our lift stops. Okay, so a long explanation of something that happens very simply. But if we go back to our game, select our lift, scroll down, you can see that I've already attached our script. Let me just go ahead and delete that by hitting this gear and going down to remove component. And I'm going to go back to my project files. And this is my file here, my script. To create that initially, just right click here, go to create, and go to C# script. We also have the possibility of writing this in JavaScript if you're a little bit more familiar with JavaScript. Or, well, actually it looks like they removed the boo. There used to be one called boo, which is very similar to Python. It doesn't look like you can add that anymore, but that's okay. Never used it. C# is what most of the examples are in. You can also find some JavaScript examples. So select this one, you give it a name, and then you right-click on it, and here's your starting file. So it looks very similar to our lift file. So once you've written that, just drag this onto the platform, select our platform, and now you can see that our script is back after I deleted it. And again, when this lifts up all the way to the top, select that elevator stop object. There's only one collider in here, and it'll stop. Okay, so let's go ahead and just play this. And I can move my mouse around because this is first person. I can look up. You can see I'm very slowly coming up to the top here. Very slowly coming up to the top. And as we reach the top, okay, and you might not have seen it in the bottom left-hand corner, it says collided. If I hit, let's see, Command-Shift-P, yeah, that pauses it. And I can go back to my console window, and it says collided. That was the debug statement, so I know that that happened. And it stopped there. Okay, and then using ASDW, I can walk through my scene. So it looks a little funky because there's no materials on it. There's no lighting. It's just straight up geometry that we created in Blender. So here's the door frame, and then here's just a big room. And again, it looks kind of funky because the geometry is just really big and like that. So again, I have a mesh collider, so as I jump up, actually I do have sound if I turn the sound on. And you also notice that the camera's bouncing. And this all has to do with the standard assets that come with Unity that I've imported. So you can go up to Assets, Import Package, Characters, somewhere. Oh, there they are. Just hovering on it. Select Characters. And because I have this pre-installed, it actually comes with Unity, but if you have other packages, it'll ask you which ones to install. You have a, let me collapse these down to see the hierarchy ones. Okay, so we have a first-person controller that comes with Unity. We have a roller ball, which is kind of fun if you guys ever played Marble Madness. It's an old NES game where you roll this marble around on platforms and try not to fall off, but it has momentum. So you're hitting the forward key or the forward button, it rolls, and if you go too far, you roll off the edge. It's really a lot of fun. You can add that kind of controller to your game, and I haven't seen it yet. Don't hang me out to dry, but I haven't seen the new Star Wars movie yet. But apparently there's a little droid that is a ball, so maybe if you want to make a game around that, you can use that one. And then the third-person controller, which I showed you last class with the dungeon scene, that's how we get that. And so if I'm just interested in the first-person one, I would check that. You can check these off if you want. I've already imported it, so I won't continue to import that. But that then goes down to your standard assets folder, under characters, first-person controller, and then under prefabs, you just drag it onto the scene. And that's how you get that guy on the scene. Now it's going to complain because I have two of those guys. So I'm going to command delete that. So that's how we get our games into the scene. Now for our mesh that I didn't show you how we brought that in, saved it into Blender, dragged the .blend file into our window here. But if you wanted to edit it, I dragged it into this file called lift. I can double click on that, and yeah, I didn't do anything for there, so let's go ahead and open that. You can see now I can edit these vertices. So let's say my railings weren't too tall. This is actually a problem that I ran into. I'm going to hit the B key to do box select, select all those top vertices, hit the G key to grab, and then the Z key to limit that to the Z axis, and then just move my mouse up. Let's say that sounds good. Now in Blender, I've switched this to meters because that's also what Unity uses, and so I can measure this out very, very exact to say that this all starts at 0 pretty much. So the 0 coordinate on the Z-axis is 0. So right now these railings are 1.84517 meters tall, and that's actually a little bit taller than I am. I think I'm 179 centimeters or something like that. But so this is a little bit taller than me. So maybe this is more like a cage. But let me go ahead and hit save. So Command S, click, or you can go to File and save here. Switch back over to Unity, and it's going to take a second. And you didn't see it happen, but it actually re-imported that for me. And now you can see that those railings are a lot taller. And so now you can kind of get the idea of if I create something very simple in Unity, or excuse me, in Blender, I can bring it into Unity, double click on the asset after I've done that, open it up in Blender, manipulate it, save it, come back into Unity and see if that's okay, and very quickly prototype a game out. So, okay, that's a little bit about eye level, maybe a little bit above eye level. Not quite at the top of my head. But what I can do is I can pause that. Oops. Let's see. The lift is already lifted up. I can select my player, my first-person player here, and I can manipulate how tall that player is. And right now his height is 1.8. So actually that's pretty much taller than me. And that makes sense because if I look at the model here, you can see those railings are right above the height level. So when you're making things like buildings or cars or things like that, you know how tall those are relative to your player. So you can measure those very, very exact in Blender, pull them into Unity, and my player is probably actually a little bit on the high side, the tall side, compared to the average. Well, it depends if it's female, right? But if it's the average player, maybe make that a little bit shorter. But you match up your assets. So, for instance, this door height I actually did measure in Blender, which is why I wanted to do it before class, because it does take a little bit of work to try to get that to be a proper height. I think I made that 2.5 meters, something like that. Yeah, and it's in meters. So if you guys are not familiar with meters, then it's a good time to learn. But yeah, that's how you create a basic game. You can see that with triggers. Maybe as I walk into that big room, I play a sound, I spawn enemies, that sort of thing. So these are just the building blocks. That's all I want to cover for games. But when we go over to export it to Android, we go into the build settings, Android, switch platform. This will take a little bit. Hopefully it's not too long because I don't have that many assets. Yeah, I created that game last night, quotes, right? Air quotes around game, in about an hour. I mean, I could have done it a lot faster, but I didn't really have an idea of where I was going. I was like, let's have an elevator, and then it opens a door. But then I was like, well, how about a hallway and that sort of thing. So planning will obviously save you a lot of time. Okay, so anyway, so I switched this over to Android platform, and now when I do the build, what it'll do is it'll ask me where I want to save this. I'm just going to save it on my desktop as untitled. Then I'm going to switch over to Android Studio, because what this is doing is creating an Android Studio project for me. Oops, okay, so I forgot to set up a few items in here, namely the, let's see, what am I looking for? Publishing settings. I'm just going to create a quick one here. So your bundle is what normally Android Studio has in here. I'm just going to call it BSU, EDU, BSU. Yeah, actually it's Boise State. So that's a different website, isn't it? Boise State, EDU, and then just game. Whatever you can name it. Pretty much whatever you want. Okay, so now we should be able to build this. Just untitled, fine. Switch back over to Android Studio. Go to Open. Give that a second. Oh, and actually it didn't create the studio. It created the APK file, which I could then drag on to Android Studio. I forgot one setting. Let's see. Click the Google Android project. That's important. Yeah, this will create the Android Studio project. Sorry about that. Okay, and did that do it? Where did that go? Oh, yeah, it was beeping at me, wasn't it? So error. Okay, I had a build error there, so just do that. To game. Oops. All right, sorry about that. I was trying to do it too quickly. Okay, so put it in another folder called store, which is just what I named the Unity project. All right, so if you recognize this Android manifest file, we have some assets in here with some binary data. You can see that we have this file called shared assets, which is probably, we don't really have too much in there, so these files aren't going to be big. But if you had textures and that sort of thing, those usually go in there. And they're actually all packaged up in there. We have source files. You can actually look at these. There's not too much in there, but long story short, let's just go. Dope. Why did we do that? Let me actually open up the project. Okay, so hit enter. This window. Configure that, and here, nope. Oh wow, closed it. Oh, there it is. Okay, never mind, sorry. Okay, so normally you wouldn't have to touch any of these files, but what you would then do is then you would run it normally. Apparently it didn't pick up the actual Android file, so let me add this, configuration build. Not seem to be working. Well, the nice thing is you can actually export, you can skip the whole Android Studio and export it out to an APK file like you just saw, add your signing key to that, or your key store to that, and take that file and then upload it to the Google Play Store. So we'll cover that in another class of how to actually do that process and setting up the Google Play Store so that you can upload your own applications. But that's the starting point of it. In Android Studio, just give you a little hint for over the break, you can do, where is it? Yeah, sorry. Build APK, and that essentially builds your APK file. That's your Android application package that you can then take that file and upload it to the App Store. Okay, well, I knew I was going to end early. I just kind of wanted to give you the general basis of how to design, create assets, and export it out to Android. And so hopefully if this is interesting to you, you can go off and learn some more. Or if you have other interests that are in 3D or in game development, not just games, but modeling and showing off models in a 3D interactive environment, either VR, that sort of thing. Hopefully this is a great start for you guys. Otherwise, I will see you in 2 weeks after break. And if you have questions, please stay after. We can talk about your project or whatever else.